Good evening and welcome. I'm Chris Parnell.
Reporting from Moscow.
Tbilisi.
Times Square.
May your dreams be your only boundaries in life.
All persons held as slaves within any rebellious state shall be thenceforward and forever free.
Paraphrasing the language of the great commoner of a generation ago, you shall not crucify the South on this cross of civil rights.
In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
If you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake.
Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized. Units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
Somebody started yelling, "Lynch her, lynch her." I tried to see a friendly face. I looked into the face of an old woman and it seemed like a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me.
I think it was the most terrible thing that has ever been seen in America. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm sounding patriotic or something like that, but I always thought that all men were created equal.
It was really happening, what I'd imagined for so long, the drama of good and evil playing itself out on the stage of the living, breathing world. That paddy wagon seemed like a chariot to me, a freedom vehicle carrying me across the threshold.
To move into Washington, we are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
In the same room where President Lincoln signed the first Emancipation Order in 1861, President Johnson signed the 1965 Voter Registration Act and pledged to millions of Americans a new chance to find a political voice.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of GHS-TV's award-winning talk show, Crosstalk. I'm your host, Renee Meeman. Each week in this time slot, we take a look at different issues, personalities, and events that affect you and our community. Black History Month can trace its roots back to the 1920s, when it was a week of celebration. But since then, there have been thousands of African Americans who have helped shape this country and the world. The video you saw at the beginning highlighted just some of the major events of one of the most pivotal times in U.S. history, the Civil Rights Movement. This week, we are celebrating Black history and looking deeper into the role Memphis played. Today, we'll speak with Madeline Taylor of the Memphis chapter of the NAACP and Dr. Noel Trent of the National Civil Rights Museum. But first, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ladrika Mensenfer of the African and African American Studies Department at the University of Memphis. It's a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
As I mentioned, Black history recognition dates back to the 1920s.
Yes.
How was it started?
Well, when Carter G. Woodson, I guess I want to say realized, but recognized or wanted to make certain that the accomplishments and the history of African American people in this country would be acknowledged and shared not only amongst the people themselves, but amongst the nation. He set about to begin what was initially, as you know, a week, and then that transformed into a month. And it became a way of, I guess, the way I teach my students of how do you allow people who were denied any type of sense of an identity or really any real sense of citizenry to recognize that there is a history and there's a long, strong, proud history. And I think the 1920s, as you note, especially when it's established in 26, is important because this is in the middle of a period called the Harlem Renaissance, when we had this rebirth in literature and art of African American writers, thinkers, philosophers, but individuals thinking about how do we celebrate and highlight the accomplishments, but also the beauty of African American culture.
What's the significance of the month of February? Well,
February is really an interesting month because when it was selected for this, initially for the week, and then also for the month that becomes, it's a way to encompass both the birthdays of President Lincoln, who you all feature very dominantly in your trailer, intro to this, but also Frederick Douglass, who was a great African-American statesman, a former slave turned literary, political, international hero and advocate against the idea of bondage for human beings.
What was the reaction of the American people at that time?
At that time, you think about in the 1920s, we still have segregation, we have lynchings occurring rampantly throughout the South. We still have, we have the establishment of African American colleges, but we're really only, if you think about it by this point, just think about it, roughly about 60, 70 years out after slavery, 60 years actually. So the reaction is, it's almost shocking, like, is there really a history? I think both interracially and interracially for individuals to celebrate and to acknowledge.
Why was the establishment of this Black History Week essential for the survival of Black Americans?
I would argue that it was essential because it became a way to nationally, publicly acknowledge again the roles of individuals many who were unsung at that time, many who did not know they would have a voice or didn't recognize, and also for people to realize that these individuals had sacrificed and they managed to survive despite the atrocities of slavery in the country. So it's about, again, reinserting, and I use that term a lot, reinserting into American memory, into African American cultural memory, that these individuals, people of the African American race, helped to build this country, and they are just as part of a fabric of it as anyone else.
Dr. Mensenfer, how was this designated week, how did this contribute to this civil rights movement in the 60s?
Well, you think about it, we have about roughly almost 34 years, 36 years between the establishment of what was called Negro History Week, now Black History Week, Black History Month, and then the Civil Rights Movement. By the time we get to the Civil Rights Movement, and there are dates different dates, you have 1950s, sometimes some people think about 1960, but think back to really about the 1950s when we have the Brown versus the Board of Education case, when we have the Montgomery boys boycott, which was extremely successful in making us understand about the economic contributions that African Americans make, and also the idea of separate but equal needed to be shut down on public transportation. But when we think about how Black History Month leads into that, if individuals had not known about persons, for example, like Toussaint Louverture or Frederick Douglass, or even Lincoln's contribution to African American culture with the Emancipation Proclamation, then, and it's just a possibility, who would have known that these other individuals like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Daisy Bates would be able to have heroes and sheroes to find the strength to say, I can do this, and know that what's wrong and what's right and what needs to be done.
Black history is the remembrance and the history of the African diaspora.
Yes.
However, it's not limited to just the U.S.
Yes, yes.
Where else would we find this?
Well, when you think about the diaspora, and I think that's a wonderful question, people of color, and when we go back to the history of the slave trade, particularly from the African continent, were settled all over the Americas, South America, when we think specifically about places like Brazil. So there is a way, there is a need to acknowledge the diasporic nature of not only the way people were settled from the continent of Africa, but also the contributions of individuals from the continent, their descendants in other places outside of North America. So I think Black History Month or Black History Week becomes a way to realize just how wide and vast those contributions have been.
As a professor, what do you do during this month of Black History Month?
Well, I am the director of the African and African American Studies program, but I'm also a professor, associate professor of African American literature. So I live, breathe, teach African American history and literary culture every day, for 10 months out of a year at the University of Memphis. For Black History Month, what I'm able to do is the same thing that I do every day. I teach African American literature, but the university does a phenomenal job of hosting and various Black History Month events, and I encourage my students to go. We write them into the curriculum. These sorts of things happen. So it's just kind of a natural daily occurrence for me to practice talking about Black history with my students.
Dr. Mensenfer, thank you so much for coming out today and talking with us all about Black History Month.
Thank you for inviting me.
We have to take a short break, but when we return, I'll be joined by Madeline Taylor of the Memphis chapter of the NAACP. Stay with us.
There's a meaning no one knows, waiting to be set free.
So what's the empty suitcase for?
The grand prize trophy. I was born to be somebody. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
Welcome back to this edition of Crosstalk. I'm your host, Renee Ma'am. Joining me now is Madeline Taylor of the NAACP. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, the NAACP was formed in 1909.
Yes.
What events led to its formation?
Well, in 1909, 1908 really, there was lynching across the country of the former slaves, and not just in the South, but in all areas of the country. And there was one event in Springfield, Illinois, which was the home of Abraham Lincoln, which made it so significant, where the blacks were being lynched. And that forced a group of whites and blacks to come together in what they call the Niagara movement, because they met over in Canada just to be sure that they would not be disturbed. And they formed an organization which we now know as the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. It was predominantly white, but there were a number of blacks involved, especially W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and a number of others.
Why did it take almost 50 years after the abolishment of slavery to establish this organization?
Well, I don't know if that's really what happened as much as within 50 years after the abolishment of slavery, people were still being enslaved and treated totally unfairly. They were being accused and convicted on the street and not having any of the benefits of the Constitution for which they were hopefully trying to be citizens. they came to this country as slaves. They were now sort of free, but not free. They could not own property. They could not be educated. They were not having the full benefit of the society in which they've been brought into. They didn't have access to the benefits provided for in the Bill of Rights or in the Constitution. And it was quite a while and quite a bit of lynching and a lot of riots across the country. This year, Memphis will recognize a riot that happened here in Memphis, which we call the Massacre of 1866, where a number of blacks who were living in Memphis, freed slaves, were attacked, and their homes were burned, schools were burned, churches were burned, and at least 46 people were killed. And of course, nobody really talks about them. It's not in our history books. And this is one thing we're trying to bring forward, the Massacre of 1866 in Memphis.
How are you going to do that? What are you doing to observe this?
Well, we've joined with a number of organizations in the city. First of all, the University of Memphis, and they've built a website scheduling all of the events that will relate to the massacre in Memphis. There will be a number of events. Lemoyne College will have some events talking about the religious aspects and just trying to resolve the soul of the people who died there and were never remembered. The Memphis branch has worked with the National Park Service in order to place monuments in an area that we think was the area of the massacre, which is down on G.E. Patterson at the Army and Navy Parks. But these are all activities we're trying to bring together. We will have town halls and talk sessions to try to let the community know what happened, because it's not in the history books.
Well, what do you have to say about the many comments and criticisms of Black history not being integrated into mainstream education?
Well, this is something that, as a college student, I worked vigorously for, because there was no Black history. We went to college and they told us, well, you're culturally deprived. I said, yep, probably so, because I don't have access to the history of myself and my people. And we work very vigorously to ensure that education about Blacks, African Americans, Africa is incorporated in the educational system, whether it's in secondary school, elementary school, or higher education, and become an integral part, not something that you take as an extra or elective.
How do you play a big part in keeping the tradition of Black History Month alive?
Well, we're doing it right now because we're here talking about it in a communication medium. I'll be talking to students and adults throughout the month, just focusing on this. But it's not just me. The fact that's most important is that other people are doing it as well. Everybody's having a program or a salute to Black history or some type of event that touches every part of the community and all of the fabric of the community, not just what is the NAACP doing.
Although you are an African American civil rights organization, your mission statement ensures the equal rights of all people. Could you talk about that?
Well, certainly. Our mantra was to make sure that the Constitution written by the people in this country applied as well to us. And we have worked over the years to have certain laws established. And in fact, when they were established, they applied not just to us, but to all people who had been discriminated. The women's movement came right behind us and was able to benefit from many of the laws in employment, in housing, and everything else that we were able to have implemented.
Well, Ms. Taylor, thank you so much for being with us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh, my goodness.
This was a fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you. I'm just so proud to see these young people and students doing this broadcasting.
It's time to take a short break. When we come back, Dr. Noelle Trent from the National Civil Rights Museum will join us. Welcome to Germantown High School, an international baccalaureate creative and performing arts optional school, a destination school for students who are going places.
Our students are of the highest caliber when it comes to their academics and knowledge.
The IB program is a very rigorous program.
You were challenged in a way that you thought you couldn't be challenged. You succeeded, something that other kids may not have thought they could do.
They're accepted to colleges that are just, dream colleges for so many people.
Germantown High School offers a CAPA program, the Creative and Performing Arts program.
When I first came here, I saw the television studio and I was just amazed at what all I saw.
Kids do everything, that they're taught every detail that has to do with theater arts and creative arts.
I love a lot of things about Germantown High School, but primarily what I love is the athletics. There's something exciting around every single corner.
We probably are one of the most diverse high schools in the state of Tennessee, maybe the United States.
I would never doubt about sending your child to Germantown High School.
This high school is something not like any other high school that we have.
There's definitely fun in the work. We find fun in everything we do.
Welcome back to this edition of Crosstalk. I'm your host, Renee Mam. Joining me now is Dr. Noelle Trent from the National Civil Rights Museum. It's a pleasure having you on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
The National Civil Rights Museum was born out of one of the most tragic events in U.S. history, but it took almost 2 decades to get the museum up and running. What's the story?
Well, here's what happened. On April 4th, 1968 at 6:01 p.m., Martin Luther King is assassinated. The Lorraine Motel at that time was a high-end hotel that was owned by the Bailey family, and it was primarily for African Americans because they couldn't stay anywhere else in Memphis. So after the assassination, the hotel continues to operate, and it's not until about the 1980s that it goes into bankruptcy. Now, at that time, when that happens, there is a discussion about what should happen to this building. It is a significant moment in American history, and because of his assassination, there are responses that reverberated throughout the country and throughout the world. So by the 1980s, we do see a group of men and women come together to push for the preservation of the building and the formation of a institution or organization to preserve civil rights history. So it wasn't until 1991 that the museum formally opens as the National Civil Rights Museum, and it's the first museum of its kind in the nation specifically dedicated to the modern civil rights movement.
Well, recently the museum underwent a massive renovation. Walk us through some of the new exhibits.
Well, what we did was we did $27.5 million renovation, and so when you come to the museum, it's completely different from what it was before. We talk about slavery and the connections to West Africa, how African Americans got to the United States, and then you'll see a film that gives you an idea of what the messaging is of the museum and gives you a greater context for what you're about to see. So then we walk people through the different phases of African American history, starting with the Jim Crow period, which roughly runs 1896 to 1910s. And then we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, Rosa Parks' bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, everything from the Birmingham bombing, as well as the March on Washington and the Black Power movement. And you ultimately end near the room where Dr. King stayed right before he was assassinated. So we kind of walk people through about 100 years or so of history.
Well, you actually added a replica of the Supreme Court oral argument that happened. Could you tell us about that?
Well, with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, it was one of it was one of many cases that went before the Supreme Court dealing with this issue of racial discrimination in schooling and segregation. And so what we've done is when you come into that area, not only do you see the columns and it looks very judicial, but you actually see the oral arguments. And then you're able to see some of the various footage from that time period as well. We also have maps, an interactive map that you can click on to see the different schools and different sites that were involved in this struggle to end segregation in education. I will say that although Brown happened in '54, there were other cases. In the '40s, there was a case in California with a Hispanic family. And in the 19th century, we had a case with a Chinese-American family in San Francisco, as well as another family in Boston. So Brown built off of all these cases. So it wasn't just a major success for African Americans, it's a major success for American citizens.
What feedback have you gotten from Memphians and tourists on this new exhibition?
Well, I think one of the things that we've learned is people just love it. They love the new interactives. We've got great primary stories from folks who actually went through different experiences, and it's everything from recorded testimonies from people from the 1900s to people who were children. Here in Memphis, there's a group known as the Memphis 13, group of kids who integrated Memphis schools. We have their stories on what it's like to be a 6-year-old and integrate into a kindergarten or a first grade class. And then we have just really great sensory experiences. There's a walk that you'll take which really immerses you in the experience of being a marcher in the Selma March. And there's music that you can listen to. So you get an idea of not just what people were saying at the time, but what people were singing and what people were wearing. And people really appreciate just the new objects and the experience that they get.
What are some of the things the museum offers during Black History Month?
Well, we offer a lot of different things throughout the year. Black History Month is our big moment to shine. So this Friday we have a production on the life of Frederick Douglass that is free and open to the public. Its reception starts at 5:30. The production will start at 6, and then we'll end with a panel on Douglass's life and his relevancy to the modern civil rights struggle. And then on February 18th, we have a book talk called From Bullet to the Ballot by Jacoby Williams. And what he does is he talks about the Black Panther Party in Chicago. And what a lot of people don't know is that there were differences regionally between the Black Panther parties. So the party in Chicago actually more aligns itself with the philosophy of Dr. King than the party in Oakland and San Francisco. And so it's a great way to kind of explore those issues as well as what people were really fighting for. And I think that's appropriate in this presidential election year.
Dr. Trent, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to again thank all of our guests for being on the show today. Remember, Crosstalk can be seen each week at 9:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Mondays, 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. Thursdays, and 7:30 p.m. on Sundays. For more information on our programming, please check us out on the web at GHS-TV.org, where we're streaming live 24 hours a day. You can also check us out on Facebook and Twitter. As we leave you today, here's another look at events surrounding the civil rights movement. I'm Renee Mam. From all of us at GHS-TV, thank you for watching Crosstalk, and I hope to see you again.
The Mississippi River. Well, you can count them one by one. It could be your son. Count them 2 by 2. It could be me or you. Count them 3 by 3. Do you wanna see? Count them 4 by 4. Oh, well, into the river they go. Oh, well, into the river.